Good evening. Good evening. I'm Bernard Green, Chair of the Brookline Select Board, and also Chair of the Martin Luther King Celebration Committee. And welcome to tonight's MLK Committee program titled A Conversation on Race with Dr. Deborah Plummer. Dr. Plummer is author of the book, Some of My Friends Are, The Daunting Challenges and Untapped Potential of Cross-Racial Friendships. This book is available in the hallway for purchase by Booksmith, and I urge you to get a copy because it's very interesting, informative, and an important book for the type of conversations we're having around issues of race and related things here in Brookline. We're also being videotaped by Brookline Interactive Group, and I understand that at some point soon, the taping of this event will be on BIG's webpage, and there'll probably be a link to the YouTube page, so look for that. So Dr. Plummer's talk tonight is one of the many programs put on by the MLK Committee, in addition to the annual MLK celebration event at the Coolidge Corner Theater. These programs seek to shine light on issues that are relevant to the work that Dr. King undertook during his life and that remain important 51 years after his death. Our purpose in these programs is to help inform discussions on issues of race in Brookline and make those discussions more thoughtful and useful. I think our program tonight will do exactly that, or precisely that. Dr. Plummer is the Chief Diversity Officer at UMass Medical School and UMass Memorial Health Care, where she has primary responsibility for developing and implementing or executing their coordinated and comprehensive diversity plan. Among her many, many accomplishments, Dr. Plummer was the lead author in the design and development of the Diversity Engagement Survey, DES, a tool used for measuring diversity and inclusion in organizations. From 1991 to 2006, she was the founding director of a graduate degree program in diversity management at Cleveland State University. And connections to Dr. Plummer, we lived in Cleveland before that time, and my wife also taught at Cleveland State University before we moved to Nashville. From 2006 to 2009, when she moved to her current position here in Boston, she was Chief Diversity Officer at the Cleveland Clinic, a very great institution in Cleveland that has worldwide significance. So being the Chief Diversity Officer there has important global implications. I will end my brief introduction of Dr. Plummer with the following quote of hers. Improving race relations is an old, stinky problem that requires a different solution than the one offered by a national conversation on race. Turning us and them into we, right? Us and them into we, is a goal that is achieved one cross-racial friend at a time. So please welcome Dr. Deborah Plummer to talk on her book, Some of My Friends Are. Dr. Plummer.
So, good evening. Good evening. So it's a Wednesday evening on an arguably, weather kind of iffy day, and yet you are here to talk about this prickly topic of race. So congratulations on that, because it's a topic that people often avoid, And so I do begin with gratitude for coming this evening. I especially want to extend gratitude to Caitlin Stark for the invitation and to Bernard Green for the warm introduction. And again, to all of you for coming, and all of you are going to view this video of our conversation. And it will be a conversation because my plan to just give you some introductory remarks to talk a little bit about the research that fueled the book and then have conversation, because that's what I'm about. as Bernard quoted, I even teach a course on advancing inclusion, turning us and them into we, and that's what we're all about. So let me start by just saying we are one race, the human race, so that we're clear on that, because so often we've forgotten that in all of this discourse, about it, and skin is really how we're packaged. And I try to remember all the time, especially, in this racially charged times, and when we have to actually call out racism in all of its forms, that love, beauty, truth, compassion are packaged in everyone. I also believe, and as a psychologist, I know that we're like those onions, like an onion, where we have all those layers, and we're not acting out of that core identity as humans all the time. And so those layers, are what makes it challenging for us to actually manage acting out of that core. And so I want to talk to you just a little bit to kind of set the stage of putting race in this context of why it's challenging. Because first of all, our brain on race and diversity does not support us that well. As you know, when we get a visual signal that comes into our brain, and race, it is a visual signal, because you can look at me and see that I'm a black woman, right? Every day I wake up a black woman, yep, checking, still black, that's pretty clear, and that evokes a whole set in terms of that signal when it goes to, the thalamus, where it's translated into brain language, and then goes over to the cortex, the visual cortex, to get into that interpretation. But what generally happens is when we get that signal, it bypasses the visual cortex, goes right from the thalamus to the amygdala, which is the emotional center of the brain. And then we're in that fight or flight response that you might remember for those of you in Psych 101, where we're either going to, defend or to, flee and just avoid it. Which is why I said most people do avoid this conversation, because we also don't have the competencies really to talk about it effectively. And clearly right now we're not getting a lot of examples of how to do this from our leaders effectively. The other thing is how we make decisions and how our brain works on diversity. That we tend to treat differences as a threat to be feared rather than a challenge to be mastered. Okay, I'm going to say that again. We're treating them as a threat to be feared rather than a challenge to be mastered. So when I see someone, who is of a different race, and we have all those social loadings, again, that are in our brain, what happens is that we have to either have the competency so we don't go into that fight or flight mode in terms of the fear piece, and there's a certain set of physiological reactions that's happening inside of us. The hormone cortisol is being, increased, and it's, giving us muscles. That's why we, feel kind of our stomach gets queasy, and all of those things when we experience things as a threat. Now, when we experience things as a challenge to be mastered, there's a different set of physiological responses that are going up that is actually good for us. That's why people like to climb Kilimanjaro, or they try out 100 million times to get on Jeopardy, which I have a friend that does that, his lifelong pursuit, of doing that. Those are things, people like challenges, even though they're hard, they still like to do that. But we're programmed to fear. And so when we're programmed to fear, it's going to keep us apart. There are also psychological factors that true, and I'm not going to go into all of those, but we just basically are tribal people, and so we have a preference for those who think like us, talk like us, look like us. They're wonderful people, aren't they? We're attracted to that. That's what we do. We also know that we're all culturally encapsulated. In other words, we live in segregated neighborhoods, and outside of our work situations, which often are not as diverse as we would like them to be, we certainly don't socialize across racial lines. And I'm going to talk more about that. We've got demographic challenges as well. until the year about 2045 or whatever, there's going to be 2 whites for every person of color still. And so, as I wrote about in the book, the one guy, Victor, who was in one of the focus groups, said, that he was sure that, he's also, at least 10 of his white friends' best friend, like 10 white people's best friend. And when he goes to their weddings, everybody knows who he is. They always say, "Oh, you must be Victor." And he says, like, "How did you know that?" Yeah, right. As soon as he walks into the event. So those demographic channels. And then the one that we have a lot more control over is personal choice. We don't often choose to have friends outside of our same racial group, largely because we are lazy. And I don't mean lazy in the slovenly way. I mean that it takes a lot of extra work. And friends are optional. And then if we have this prickly topic that we have to, talk about or get through, and the world evokes certain things for us, we don't want to have to deal with all that fight and flight response and all those things. So we just choose not to do that. But I've come, in my work over many, many, many years to become a cross-racial friendship advocate, which means that I work to promote cross-racial friendships as the sure path for healing our ever-increasingly racial divide. And I know this from my own life, but I also know that most of us don't, have cross-racial friends. And I'll tell you a little bit how I came to that discovery and why my research has been, now for, since the late 1990s, I've done a body of work on cross-racial friendships and socializing across racial lines. I was on a walk one day with my good friend Yvonne, who's African American, and we share a similar background, coming from a 2-parent household, educated, church-going family, the other kind of things. And we walk, and on these walks, we solve the problems of the world, all the time. It just hasn't been relayed to everybody else, but we do. And on one of these walks, I don't even remember what the conversation was, but she said to me, "Well, why do you have so many white friends?" And I said, "Well, don't you?" And she said, "No, not like you." And I thought to myself, well, that seems strange, because I just assumed that most people had friends of different races. And so, being the academic that I was, I sought to try to figure out what the patterns were, and I was going to prove her to be the outlier in this case. And what I found out that I was the outlier. So through focus groups and all kinds of interviews and surveys, which I've been doing since 1999, it's even more prevalent today. I did the first survey in 2003, and in 2013 I got interested over a 10-year period to see if things had changed and improved. And not only had they not changed, but they had gotten worse in the sense that in the early 2000s, when I was doing the research, people were a little bit uncomfortable in being so racially siloed, and wanted to know, had a lot more curiosity about how do we change this pattern, and actually thought it was going to change. You had lots of hope for that it would change for the future, given the generations. In 2013, to the time when this book was written, or published in 2018, just about 2019, beginning of January, in January when it was first released, in doing the work around this, the thing is people are comfortable. They just said, no, it's all right. We're good with the way that we are. And this was even, segregated churches and in religions, people just say, it's not that we're racist. It's just that we are so fundamentally different that we just are better off, in our own communities and with our own same race groups. I can see where you're going, And that's what I've said too. So I really wanted to write the book as a conversation starter. And I have 3 little hopes and 1 big hope for the book. The 3 little hopes is that it would stir up authentic racial discourse that would be more empathetic, more enlightened conversations about race. Because I honestly believe that we've had a lot of conversations about race, but we haven't had them with each other. You know, that the conversations that we've had, we need to have them with different people and with in order to change and bridge the racial divide. The second hope is that it would prompt the readers to examine their own friendship patterns and foster more cross-racial friendships or deepen the ones that we already have. The third hope was that it would cause people to think about how we might be contributing to or lessening the racial divide. Because I think we're either doing one or the other. Contributing to it maybe unconsciously, or lessening it if we're doing it more intentionally. My big hope for the book is that it's going to eradicate racism. People read the book and it all think of like magic. It actually is create a better path towards a more enlightened future of improved race relations and heal our deep racial divide. And I know it's a light one candle approach, but I do believe that happens. I've been doing book salons, which are just conversations in people's homes across the United States on this book. And it's both enlightening for me, as well as encouraging, and then also somewhat discouraging in the sense that we still have such a long way to go. I've been doing this work longer than probably some of you, a few of you like maybe have existed on this world, and knowing that I start to see the same patterns in terms of what's happening, and people, we have the awareness, but we don't seem to get past the awareness to the action. So let's talk about that a minute. And here's the thing, I began by saying we are all one race, the human race. And here's the other fact too, though, that we are all to some extent racial isolationists. So it's not just whites who don't have friends that cross-racialize, people of color don't as well. So what percentage of white Americans do you think social networks are predominantly white? What percentage? Just call it out. 91%. 91%. What about African Americans or black?
99.
It's 83%.
What was the second one?
Pardon me?
What was the last one for African Americans?
83.
80.
Yeah, and this is an aggregate of many, polls, et cetera. What about Latino, Latinx, or Hispanic? What would you say?
70, high 70.
It's about 64%, And then Asians and Natives or American Indians, what we say, I'm saying that they're both about the same. What would you say?
Low 60s.
It's about 54%. 54%. So to some extent, we are all, as I said, racial isolationists. And I pointed out some of the factors for why that's so, because we have to really make effort to do it. And as I said, friends are optional, but we, on our leisure patterns, I talk about that in the book, we do the same kind of activities, but we most often do them separately. Humor, which is a measure of what a good friendship is. Race-based humor, of course, is tricky, but also what people, when you're talking about things that are part of the human condition, like, relationships and sex and, all of those topics, like not having enough money, that affect everybody, it's kind of safe humor, but when we start to talk about conditions in the world in terms of the United States particularly and what's going on, then humor becomes very different, so that's examined in the book as well. We know that we have a different pathway to our racial identity resolution. By racial identity, I mean our psychological connection that we have with our race, that says what we evoke in the world and how we experience the world. And I always say for many whites, they're in racism or race 101, class, just coming aware of. And this has been for years. I remember in 1970, 75, when I was in graduate school, the book that people were carrying around was Bob Terry's, Robert Terry's, for whites only, you know, and every person of color, you know, I was giving it to every white friend that I knew too, you know, because it was, you know, it had the blueprint in there for how, you know, that how whites needed to wake up, and that they were the part, you know, that the controller of racism. You know, that happens today too with, you know, Robin DiAngelo's book in terms of white fragility. So I see the same patterns that are there in terms of the awareness. You know, where people of color, given the experience, are in kind of the advanced course for the most part, you know. And some also, though, because of now we think about ourselves with multiple and intersecting identities, you know, it's also a challenge for all of us. And we're all being racialized in ways that we never thought about before. In other words, you know, I can't think about myself as a African American outside of the fact that I'm also a woman, that also I'm, you know, a young old woman now because I'm in the 60s, so I'm calling that young old, you know. So young old, you know, that I, you know, have a certain socioeconomic class, that I, you know, that I have ability, you know, and all of those things that make me me, you know, so that my race didn't just walk into the door, then my sexual orientation, or I left that out there, or, you know, it's all of those multiple and intersecting identities. And when we think about generational differences in what we find is that they have a much more embrace of a multiple and intersecting identity that's far more fluid than the dichotomous kind of a traditional approach to differences and to race as, you know, my generation had and the two generations below. So it gets complicated around how the social loadings that we have in race and what they mean. You know, politics, I'm not going to get into all of that, but because race ideology affects the quality of life for people of color, you know, it's not the same option for prioritizing, say, the economy or healthcare, if it means lessening the quality of your life, you know. So it's kind of a, you know, if I vote for this, you know, but this has racism, you know, and it, you know, how do I get people to see that racism that's being portrayed impacts the quality of my life, or do I just want to reframe it, you know? So, pardon? So that is what's happening in today. Religion, you know, Martin Luther King, you know, said, you know, in the 1960s, early 1960s, that, you know, 11 a.m. on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America, and it truly remains that. And as I stated before, you know, the research shows that even, you know, faith communities are okay with that. You know, they're real okay with that. You know, before it wouldn't have been, but now, okay. So housing, the way we're, you know, all of this points to the fact that we're tribal people. The other thing that complicates this whole situation is that modern forms of racism, I'm talking about things like microaggressions, racial slurs, like how we see it like in gerrymandering, redlining, all of those things that are coming back, you know, or not coming back, but are just kind of come to the forefront again. Those modern forms of racism, you know, that we see being played out, which are more covert and sometimes intentional, but covert and unintentional sometimes, you know, that they are confusing to all of us in social interactions. They baffle and confuse us, you know, and they're challenging to navigate. You know, unconscious bias, spatial racism, you know, like if you think about the Seaport district, you know, here in Boston, you know, in terms of spatial racism and what's happening, you know, where we have these areas that then become, you know, predominantly white, and we keep them predominantly white, or we gentrify, you know, because of that. There's a whole, you know, there's a whole form of racism. You know, racial fragility, you know, we're all racially fragile to some extent, and we don't have those competencies that we need to successfully navigate or to talk and have a conversation that's meaningful about race that leads us to a different outcome, you know. Structural racism, social privilege, you know, which is people don't understand. You know, my closest white friends, the long-term white friends who I write about in this book in terms of the case studies and the thread from high school. You know, they didn't get, you know, social privilege or white privilege when we were talking about it, you know, because they think on many measures of success that I am probably more successful than they are. They don't get that. They say, oh, no, you're a lot more privileged. But we're talking about social privilege and things that they can't be aware of because that happened just because of the skin color, you know. So all of these dynamics are at play in friendships, in our social situations, and slip-ups are more likely to occur, which is why we avoid them, you know. The last part is that it takes a lot of work to obtain and maintain cross-racial friendships. It really does. But the return on the effort is certainly enormous. I'm going to read one short paragraph from the book to illustrate that. Cross-racial friendships that foster intergroup contact remain one of the most effective methods of improving race relations. They are successive approximations toward the goal of the beloved community, bringing us closer to a shared American experience, moving us from separate and unequal to together and equal. Cross-racial friends, especially those of the heart, reduce bias and change cultural beliefs, not just for the individual but they also hold the potential for positive change for their families and their circle of friends. Over time, these friendships have profound effects on healing divisions among different racial groups and fostering racial equity. Racial equity takes place one cross-racial friend at a time. So, how do you do this? People always have to tell, how do I get more friends with, cross-racial friends? Can they sign up for them? No. Let me just say that it begins with understanding ourselves as a racial being. So there's a lot of stuff on racial identity self-assessment, and if you, on my website, I have tools and like surveys that you can take. And that's really examining and knowing yourself, again, as a racial being and what happens, what race means for you. The second is examining your racial lifestyle choices, where you live, where you worship, where you shop, the organizations you support, your own support systems, where you vacation, where you buy services from. We can all make choices for more multiracial living. I'm not suggesting that you have to move if you're not white, but I think choices like even, obviously you're on that right path because you're here to have this conversation tonight. And as I said, you have other things that you certainly could be doing, I'm sure. You don't look like fooling people, you look like you have lives, The third is to acknowledge racism and unconscious bias. I happen to think about racism as kind of like a cancerous tumor that's out there that's affecting us all. And we have to be able to acknowledge and do something about it. What I'm offering is a more relational model for it, because I think in the years that I've been in the diversity, equity, and inclusion space, I've seen a lot, experienced a lot, and even worked from a lot. And I think we're into, and the frameworks that we offer are all based on a traditional approach to differences, which see them as dichotomous, as a power dynamic, all those things, kind of the dominant culture. I could look at it as talk about terms like marginalized, oppression, all of that, those concepts. So what I believe is happening now is if you think about an hourglass, and I bring my hourglass with you, but you can imagine an hourglass. And the dominant culture is the one that gets to make all the policies, practices, laws, to their liking, and that benefits them. So if you even think about what happens with an hourglass, they get to mess on the other people, it just gets, and go back to how the brain works. And so what's happening now is their fear that what's going to happen is that people of color, are going to become the dominant culture. And we talk about dominance then by numbers rather than, again, the one race. That all that's going to happen is that we're going to flip that hourglass, And then we're going to get to mess on everybody else, set up all the policies and practices and laws that will benefit people of color, In a relational model, what I'm hoping to do, and what I offer in the book as well as by how it happens in cross-racial friendships, is to lay that hourglass flat, level that playing field, and hopefully one day break that glass. So we're not confined, again, to those limitations like the onion. We're at our core identity, and that we're acting completely out of that. But I want to say, though, I'm not naive to the fact that, we're just going to make friends and it's going to be all hunky-dory, because not every cross-racial friendship helps to heal the racial divide. All of them give witness to or show the possibility of racial harmony and racial equity, but not all cross-racial friends support us to get there. In fact, some kind of actively lead us on a different path. So in the book, I've discovered through this process, there's like 5 different kinds of cross-racial friendships. The first is what I call the bubble friends. And the bubble friends are the ones where, they live in this kind of racial utopia. They say, our blood is the same. We all put our, pants on the same way. We're all alike. This is some of my friends are defense as well. I can't possibly be racist because some of my friends are, my best friend is, and actually, we don't have a knowledge base on them. Both kind of use each other in that way. There's no there's no intimacy. We did what we call, a depth of intimacy index, in terms of the friendships. So if you vacation together, present for an argument, you could borrow money, how often visited in their homes, there's a whole list of things that you would have to check. You could call the person at 3 a.m., if you needed to, And then we put down, so we didn't define friendship for people. We let people tell us, and then we measured that by depth of index, and then did all this multiple regression and all the kind of stuff that, that even I find boring, but have to do with my colleagues, in this. Anyway, so bubble friends have little depth or intimacy. Then you have fantasy friends. And fantasy friends are ones when I ask people, and most people know the socially approved answer on these surveys when you say, do you have a friend of a different race? They say, oh yeah, Then you ask them their name, and there's like, it's like the pomegranate's dog, the Pomeranian's dog's mom, or the people that sit 3 pews back from them in church, or somebody that they worked on with United Way. They don't really know them. So when somebody wants to talk about Oprah, like Oprah's my friend, Oprah's everybody's friend, it's a fantasy friend. You don't really know their names, but you have a connection. That's the fantasy. Then the calendar friends are the people that you actually do know, fantasy friends could be on Facebook too, and social media, that's somebody that you think that you like. Calendar friends are real, that you actually go out with. You may socialize with them at work, or you go out to lunch, or you maybe go out to dinner, or it's generally in a group setting or recreational, which you do know them. But they are calendar friends. There's not as much depth. And I say calendar because maybe you get together once a month, or twice a month, or every, you're there for each other, but not in the same way. It's not the depth. Then we have fellowship friends, and those are the ones where you do have depth. That there is depth of intimacy. You can talk about race, and because race is even often a taboo topic in cross-racial friendships, because you kind of like to keep it as safe friends. Fellowship friends, though, are united generally by some kind of cause or something goal that's outside of them. So often when maybe the political campaign or the cause that they were working on together is removed, that they still remain friends and are fond of each other, but they don't have that what's outside of them to draw them together. But they're still close, and they may know that. And there's examples and good case studies in the book about those. But the friends of the hearts are the ones, the fellowship friends have the power, to change race relations, but the friends of the heart are the ones that can really move those mountains of racism. And those are the ones that you have the depth and intimacy, that you can call at 3 a.m., that you have that kind of trust in an egalitarian relationship where you can talk about these things, the taboo topic of race. and then influence one another. You know, I have that, I talk about that in the book with my good friend Joan, the one that was from high school, and for preparation for the book, I said to her, you know, we've really never had racial conversations about race. I've been your safe, you know, black friend, and I realized that. So we're gonna talk about race, and if you don't mind, you know, I'm gonna do the interviews, and we'll do things when we did that. And during that time, I found out she voted for Trump, you know. And, you know, and not that I, you know, said, but I was for, and I was, you know, so we had many conversations about it, some very animated, you know, and even through, you know, this part of, but I can say that she hung in there because we have this foundation and because it is a friendship from her heart, and I hung in there because I did know her heart. However, it wasn't easy. It truly was not easy because it's like someone that you thought she knew in terms of the values, but her belief came out of her strong religious, you know, beliefs around, you know, issues like pro-life, you know, and some other things that were for her. You know, we share the same religion, but mine doesn't lead me to where her, you know, does. But so it was, those were the things that I'm saying that I can safely say now that her, you know, it's been of influence. You know, her voting patterns are things, but I'd be very surprised, you know, if she goes down that path because of her heightened awareness. Not only her heightened awareness, but because she's been challenged in ways, and I'm in her life that she can see. It's not, you know, it's not a story out there, you know. Now, I know that that's what can happen for everyone, but we know that we have to, you know, it's a value thing too. And I won't go into all of this, why it also makes it challenging, because I know the African parents are strong for that, but it's just as strong for people when they think the other, you know, which I am always surprised to hear. So we've got a lot of work to do in this. So in closing, I'm just going to, before we get some more into conversation, let me just read this last part again. I just want to say, cross-racial friendship, crossing racial lines in friendship requires the courage of knowing oneself and having a vision of the world without racial boundaries. Knowing oneself is a developmental process. Good friends, especially those who cross racial lines, expand their self-boundaries in ways that could never have been imagined on their own. Most of us are better human beings than we believe ourselves to be. We learn that in these friendships. Thank you. So, how much time do you have? About 20 minutes?
Yeah, about 25 minutes. We can, and we have till 8 o'clock, but if you want to buy books and talk after.
Yeah. So, you know what I mean? So, conversation. What struck you? First of all, what kind of, yes.
It's a comment that leads to a question. I wrote some articles about the 2010 census. I think one of the things that came out of it was that these neighborhoods, Boston wasn't being better, more integrated, and so on. But they had another statistic about likely to encounter a person of color in their daily routine. Very low numbers from Brookline, Boston, and how could it be? When I got here from Los Angeles 30 years ago, there were no black people working in the post office. This is suspicious. There were no black people working in department stores. Now it's different. Mark or Brad Mark, whatever that department store is called. Lots of black kids working there. You know, so things have changed. But I'm wondering about those encounters. I'm trying to think about when I worked with black people, and maybe some of them were like 3 or 4 levels below where I was, and didn't really encounter, would see them. So I just, those chances of, and by the way, last week is the first time I ever sat at a desk in someone else's office with a black person. I've never been in that situation. And I've worked in nonprofits in this area my whole career. I see people and go, wow, that's so great. kind of so articulate, whatever, and hearing it the first time, so I don't, and I live in Brookline, my kids grew up here in Brookline. Oh, and you know what? They have black friends from high school and from college. So maybe things are better, but I just wonder, I feel we don't have those chances to even start a friendship.
And first of all, thank you for encouraging folks and putting that out there, and for speaking your truth, which could have some socially like unapproved kind of things. Like, oh, you're admitting that, first of all, I didn't even know, like where we don't cross in that, because I think what you've spoken to is a very real fact. For many white Americans. And so they rely on what they hear in the media or, like I said, all those other social loadings that are in the brain. Coming here from Cleveland, from the Midwest, when I first moved here, well, I was kind of bamboozled. They were recruiting me when Patrick was the governor and, Obama was president and, I was coming to the intellectual capital of the world, the United States. So I was like, hey, there's no problem. Whoa! And as I came, I remember my sister and I, we were in a restaurant, and she goes, oh my gosh, even the help here is white. I was just like, where are they? Where don't people go? Where do people go? Where do black and brown people? And it was true. So I've come to learn that in New England, there's a certain racial myopia. It's what Dr. Eduardo Familia calls racism without racist, which means that there's a whole set of racial dynamics and an arsenal of practices and policies that set up that maintain, whites in control and whites being, the white privilege here. And so it's hard to unravel, and it's also crazy making because you have people who are liberal minded and who want this, but are just amazed and, how did this happen? So what I'm saying is that it requires understanding and a shared understanding about racial dynamics, which we don't have. We just don't have. So even if you're living in Brookline or or racially segregated areas, there are conversations like this that we can have. I applaud you. I truly do for coming, to start these conversations. There's ways in which you can still change that narrative for yourself and experience it without having to go up to, Bernard and say, hey, can you be my black friend? Because that's going to be false, and I don't know how Bernard is going to respond. You can try it though, but I do believe there are other things that people can do and to learn about this, because white is a race as well. Whites are being racialized now in ways that, I know many blacks are happy to see, but and people of color, because for many it's like the first time they're understanding white as an identity, and not white as something that's not black or not brown or not Asian or not native, it's or Hispanic, not something, that white is a racial, it's a racial category as well, and it means something, and to have, I've been trying to support when I teach multiracial, like applications of clinical psych or whatever, and whites for years, because I know there's a body of anti-racist education that comes out that says there's no such thing as a positive white identity because it's inherent to racism and it's inherent, in oppression, that whites are inherently racist or whites are inherently, I don't believe that, I do believe in studying racial identity development that there's a positive white identity. It's for work for white people to do. It's not people of color. People of color are trying to help white people to do it, or we have our own work to do in our own racial identity. So we have to to know what that means. And I know that we are true, and I talk about that in the book. And if we could all come to that more positive racial identity, and our core identity is that humans, and what that means as our core, then we'd be much better. But we get tied up and tether it to racism. I always say when you talk to a person of color and you ask them about their racial identity, if they just talk about it in terms of racism or white people, they don't know the true goodness. They are limited by that. The same thing if you talk to whites and they are tethered to the fact of, being racial oppressors or what, then they don't know their true identity either. And so this is how we are packaged, And we have to work together, and bumping up against those differences with each other helps us to get to know that core identity. So, there's much more to say about that. Go ahead. Yes, thank you.
So I recently found out that my parents voted for Trump.
Mm-hmm.
And they came up in a conversation that I had with my mom over the phone. And the way it came up was I was asking about friends that she and my stepdad are very close with. And she admitted that they weren't really hanging out with those friends as much. And I asked why, because they were very close. And she said, well, they were very uncomfortable when they found out that we voted for Trump. And I was like, oh. I didn't really know either. And I said, what made them uncomfortable? They have grandchildren that are Black, and so they see a vote for Trump as something that will negatively affect and impact their family. And intellectually, I think my mom kind of understood that, but I could tell that there was kind of a missing link for her. And I love my mom. She raised me to be part of the person that I am today. But I knew that she was kind of struggling to understand. So I asked her a couple of questions, and the conversation veered towards, decisions and things that our family are in. So I grew up in Maine, and marijuana is legal there to grow. And so one of my step siblings is, in that space. And so I asked her, what do you think you would think of someone who was Black, who was growing something like that? And so it started to reframe for her what she would think of our immediate family if we were a different skin color. And I think it finally kind of clicked, I think, for her.
It's a great example to try to see if you just flip it, and that's what we always try to help people to do. I too have family members who voted for Trump. Amazing, a cousin, and it was based out of their strong religious values of what, in terms of their faith, and believing that, around, again, pro-choice or just, I don't know what narratives that they're being told. But just this past Sunday, I was in Cleveland, and as I was leaving, I go to a Black Catholic church there, we're called a Catholic, but they don't pay attention to anything, you get gospel choir, stuff like that. That's the only way it can make Catholic. But anyway, and they had the Call and Post, which is the Black newspaper there, and so I picked it up because it's always of interest to me because I know so many Blacks in Cleveland, and I was at the light when I was at that. I flipped it over on the front page. There was an editorial piece, and it was written by the editor of Call and Post, and it was about all praising Trump and using a lot of scripture passages to say this man was ordained for us and sent by God, and looking at all the things that are happening in the Black community as a result of those jobs. I mean, it was just
A recent one?
really, it was just, it was mind-boggling to me, but again, remember I work in the space of trying to turn us and them the we, so I think, okay, I thought, I said, you should really read this in depth instead of what I actually put it in the recycle bin as soon as I got home. But now I wish, I want to go back online and just read it through when I'm not as emotionally charged about that, but I'm saying that, there is a moral reframing that's happening for understanding why, that they can take those same things and make it okay. So what and so again, how we're packaged is not going to tell us, who people are, and where they are. Because if I were to, people were to do an environment, like a scan, a racial scan, they would think, okay, if you're a person of color, that this is where you stand, this is when if you're white, this is what's happening, because for many people of color, they don't, they have to scan now and try to see if we trust, are you a Charlottesville kind of white person, or are you, who are you, And I think for many whites now, in terms, like I said, with racial identity, to say, no, that's not white identity, that's not who we are, but if that's, what identity politics means, and we want to, disavow that. But yet what we have to do is to go deeper and get a shared understanding about what racism is, get a shared understanding about what, go through our own racial identity process. And we do that best in those kind of conversations, just like you had to see.
It was equally as important for me to listen to her, to understand, and for her to listen.
Exactly.
I gained a deeper understanding of how someone I love could go through them.
Yeah. It was the same for me with Jonah. My family members, I didn't like them anyway, so it was just, to be honest, they were people that for lots of other reasons in terms of personality, it just made sense. We were only together because it was my mother's 90th birthday party, and so they were all there. It was like, oh, how many more days you were staying in my house, that kind of thing. But but you're right. I think if we do have the courage and take the deep breath, to go deeper and to see, understand, and get to that core, you might make progress. Yes.
I have a question, and maybe a change of focus or another experience to analogize. But the title of your book is Some of My Best Friends Are, or Some of My Friends Are. Well, that used to be said, some of my best friends are Jewish. And it was the same thing, so we can't all put all whites in the same basket. So my question is this. I'm Jewish too, and I have seen a big change in attitudes towards Jewish people in the years that I have lived here. I mean, in the 40s, there were all sorts of places they couldn't go, they couldn't live. When they did surveys, they would say, people didn't want to live next door to a Jew, or they didn't want their kids to marry a Jew. That has changed enormously. So I guess my question is, do you have any sense of why that changed, and how does that translate into changing the experience of African Americans?
Why you think it changed for Jews?
Why did it change? What changed that dynamic, and can that be applied?
Well,
that lesson be applied?
Well, there's a whole book that's called How the Jews Became White.
Yes.
And it's based on, there's an older one that's called How the Irish Became White. And it explains the kind of historical and dynamics that happened. That it's largely around, kind of the economic, pieces in the United States. But I would report and suggest that the world that I'm seeing, at least the people that I hear, they're not as friendly to the Jews as we think they, I think, I have two very close friends, in fact, one that I was just over asked before coming here, who was Jewish, and we have lots of conversations about the things that are happening, and it's scary to me in terms of what's happening with the synagogue, and what people think, even in terms of Jews, and the kind of anti-Semitic kind of remarks I've been hearing that people are free to say. It's just like makes me want to throw up, So I think there's a revival of that, which to me is very, very scary, very scary. I also know that the isms work the same way no matter what dimension of diversity you put into it. Again, remember these are dynamics. So whether it's race, gender, sexual orientation, age, class, the isms work exactly the same way. You know? That's a whole course, and I want, try to give you the snapshot of it, but the underlying human behaviors work exactly the same way. If you think about a chart in four, like a 4-box, they're either going to be overt and intentional, like Holocaust, slavery, Charlottesville, overt, unintentional, which are like the jokes that we may have, the Halloween costumes, racially offensive Halloween costumes, all of those, phrases that people say. It's covert, intentional, redlining, gerrymandering, passive tolerance of racist remarks, i.e. the Republicans who won't vote, at least even to censor or to avoid, that's just as bad, passive tolerance of somebody. Then there's that box, which is the modern forms of racism, which I've talked about, which is covert and unintentional offense. That people, is mystery to folks. That's the unconscious bias. That's the spatial racism. That's the, implicit stereotypes. All those things that have kind of gotten into our culture, that is really hard to unravel and we don't understand. And that's where it lies because unless it's really clean, and what's happening now, because we have the highest office of our country doing some of the overt intentional boxes, that people, it's even confusing some, and then people think, well, it's somebody's opinion, it's somebody's, it's more about intention rather than impact, And we always measure the ism by the impact rather than the intention, Like if I were to wrestle you to the ground, put my foot on your neck, and then look down at you lovingly and say, what's your name now? Alice? Helen? Say, Helen, you look like such an interesting person. I really would like to get to know you better. Which one would you be paying more attention to? My foot on your neck or or my words? And so what we're saying is that the impact, the cumulative impact over time, it doesn't matter in terms of intention, But we're trying, but there is sometimes when the intention is the person didn't know. But if you're in, like the higher topic, you should know and responsible, you can't reframe that. But we're to a point where we have to marry intention and impact. Because again, what's happening, which makes understanding these isms so confusing, is that we're giving sometimes the same reaction of an impact of being stepped on, like slavery, to a microaggression. And so, when somebody gives you something, I try to help people to see if the intention is pure and it's directional and it's conscious and the person has high power, that's when you need to, give it all your oomph and to try to eradicate things social. If if it's just that they were reckless, and they don't understand, kind of medium, they just made, like a remark that, that they didn't know, then you coach and help, support. I'll give you a quick example. My husband and my neighbor, this was when I was in Cleveland, we were talking about a car. My husband was talking about a car that we were getting for one of the kids in the church, to our neighbor, who's a physician, white physician, so they're educated people. My husband's an engineer. And I heard him say, we Jewed him down. And I was like, whoa, excuse me? I'm gonna walk out there, what did you just say? They were like, both of them were like, Jewed them down? And I said, and he goes, Juded? And I said, what? And he goes, Jude, the verb. We say it at the job all the time. The people, at the job say it all the time. I said, do you know what that word means? It's not Juded, So I gave him a little education, which I often have to do as a diversity, because I say this is embarrassing that your wife does this for a living and this is what you say and do, But anyway, they were both surprised because it had been in our culture so long of phrases, like they say that in the job all the time, like that made it right. So so with that, I don't want to go thermal. I want to be able to coach or educate or just say, oh, what did you mean by that? Ask. And then if it's a microaggression, it's a complete unintentional, like slight slur, it's like somebody taking popcorn and just dinging it at you, You don't want to give them the same kind of reaction. But we are, I've got lots and lots of examples that when somebody would say something and somebody would just, And so we have to do our work around this and help to get where we need to go. But because we are in this land where we don't have those competencies.
Yeah, I think that with the kind of overt racism that we are subject to from, as Angela Davis called it, the occupant, that when you're talking to people about things like microaggressions or we're all racist, we were brought up in a racist society, and people say, I'm not racist, because they're comparing themselves to him.
Right, exactly.
And saying, I'm not like that,
Exactly.
what are you talking about? And so I think it's hard to, you have to qualify everything.
Exactly,
in
exactly.
ways that just keep you kind of jumping around.
Yeah. You bring up such a good point. Because people, the good news is that no one wants to be called a racist, not even Trump. People resist. Even racists don't want to be called racist.
Yes.
So that's the good news, that it still has that, it's ugly. At the same time, people equate then that is the only form of racism. That's why we need to keep talking about what are the modern forms of racism, and then but also put them in perspective. Because modern forms, are not the same as overt intentional. They're not the same as covert intentional. So the unintentional ones we have to start supporting people to understand. Yes.
So I go to a church here in Brookline with predominantly Asian and white. We recently started worshiping in the Black church in Brookline as well for a little over a year now. But I think something that was difficult for my friends and I to understand or even realize was like the sacrifice that it took for our friends in this Black church to come and worship in our space, like giving up this literal and physical space where they felt safe to like talk about the things that were happening in society that they felt very like oppressed by or upset by. And so I'm wondering what you feel are, like what do you think makes an environment safe for people of color to like have to even begin these friendships, like we've been saying, so like create that opportunity.
Right. That's such a good question, because I do think, it's like anybody who has been abused or anybody who's, it's really, really hard, to go in a welcoming stance, or to put that. So I do understand. I have many heard through these focus groups, white people, African Americans, Latin Americans who will say, I'm done with whites. I'm done. And they truly mean it. I don't have any, one woman said to me, I don't have any use for them. They are done. And I know that there are whites who are baffled, who, like I said, just out of fear, they're going to stay in their corner because they don't want to get involved in all of this mess. I don't know, in terms of safety, there's the emotional safety, and I think that only happens when trust gets built. And so when you can have trust, a foundation of trust, which again, I only believe can happen in an egalitarian relationship, not in a work situation. I've been doing, diversity, equity, inclusion work in organizations for over almost 30 years now. And I used to, but I don't believe that's where we're going to make good progress. I don't believe anymore. even though that's where we're gonna find our most racism, because we don't have egalitarian relationships, we still have the power dynamics. I just, was saying to, actually, my friend Karen, who I was visiting right before this, that as I'm getting ready to retire, I just realized, that I have been reporting to a white man, in the D&I space all my career, having to convince them, get them, and they still had the power. They still had the power to control that. So, and even in the dynamics that I have to always make sure that my conversation, my narrative, take care of or make things comfortable for, or sets the ground for, or the climate for, And so we're not going to have those real conversations, except if we're going to have them on friendship. So trust. So I also think what you're doing in terms of multiracial living, mixing it up, like they have in, teaching tolerance in the schools where they have, mix it up day, where the kids eat in different, lunch tables and stuff like that. We have to do that for adults. We have to start those, we have to intentionally start these things, to be able to start and have these conversations in state climates like this one, hopefully where, we can have these conversations where we can honor and respect the fact, and I knew like I wasn't really good with my family members about the Trumpers, I've written them off, but my friend, I was able to have more conversation with influence. I don't know if that helps.
I think it was good, affirmation or confirmation, like you were talking about these levels of friendship, I guess, they all operate on some level of trust. That is what we're working towards.
Yeah. I happen to, until we change what we change what we do after 9 to 5, what we do in our social dynamics, what we do with our friendships. I don't think we're really going to change, it's not going to change the narrative.
I was just curious because I couldn't hear what you said. Did they, when you talked about the two groups worshiping together, did one group come to the other space, or did you
Yeah,
go
so they
share,
came to our space.
they came to your space?
Yeah.
So the African American church group came to
Yeah.
yours? Because one thing sometimes is maybe your church going to their space. I don't know where their home space was, if they had a home space.
Yeah, they've also been getting smaller, so logistically, they decided to come over and worship in our space, but things like, us leading events, like setting the kinds of events that we were putting on to have our churches gone, like, we realized after the fact that they weren't necessarily things that the other church wanted to do,
So they came as it was a matter of economics, or they needed a space? Or?
No, they didn't use space. I forget exactly how.
It's just one of those invitations.
But yeah, we kind of realized all the ways that they were kind of following what we were doing, and we hadn't considered, the way that they worship and the way that they felt comfortable and how they lived, et cetera.
Yes, Jim.
So I was wondering, and maybe this is something I need to look in the book about, but it occurs to me that one of the things, many of us lead very busy lives, and if we do what we've always done, we're going to find what we always found. And whether you address in the book sort of, ways of changing patterns in order to give yourself an opportunity to make connections that you might not ordinarily make. And I think you sort of touched on it a little. You said, maybe don't shop where you always shop, or, those kinds of things. But is that something that, you go into in the book? And
Yeah, a little bit. We struggle between, how do you make this a how-to kind of thing versus, setting up the awareness piece.
Yeah.
So there is a little bit of how-to, but one of the things that I know is that it is far more complex to do it so it's not a simple process. Like you said, we have busy lives. I talked about that. Friendships are optional. The way, the dynamics are set up in our cities, et cetera, the economics. But I think what can happen is that we can make simple, intentional choices about even, what programming we listen to, where we shop, who we support in terms of our, like positions. We can intentionally, you know, everything, we can make choices about it. You know, just like people of color often make choices where I'm gonna look for a black doctor. You know, this is another thing my husband in terms of Jewish, he wants to make sure that we have a Jewish accountant and a Jewish, but I mean, he names his people. Because, and it's just a stereotypical, but he always says, that's who I want. They're better at that. I said, she's like crazy with that kind of stuff. But, you know, people make intentional choices about who they support and who they don't support. We can do that. You know, that's a step. You know, what we read, what, you know, movies we go to see. You know, we don't have to think Black Panther is just a black movie, you know, so we don't see it if it's got an all black cast. You know, that we're not gonna look at it. Because that makes a difference in changing those dynamics of those numbers too, you know. If you ever say something, did you want to say something?
Thank you.
I was just gonna say that if you wanna talk about this more, I spend a lot of time very intentionally doing this, because I have 2 kids of color, and we made the choice to live in Brookline, and we made it very aware of the fact that we'd be in a predominantly white space. So when my son, when Altamo, and he knows my son, wanted to do, when they were doing swim team, we did not do the Brookline swim team. We went into Boston and went to one of the community centers, and we did swim team in the Hennigan's Community Center in GP. So a third of the other swimmers were black, a third were Latino, a third were white, their 2 coaches were black, and we swam against all these other Boston community centers. When my son wants books, I go to the booksmith with a list, and I say, you have to order these books for us. So
Yeah.
then my son is reading books, and my daughter is reading books with characters of color who represent them. So when my daughter goes to dance, we go to a dance place that has a lot of diversity. So it does require, you have to be intentional. We have a black female pediatrician here in Brookline. You know, as soon as I found her, we dumped the prior pediatrician, and I said, look, we have somebody that looks like my kids, that can model for my children, that when I have issues that are related specifically to racism and race and skin and development, I can talk to her about it. So it's totally possible, but it is totally work.
Yeah.
If you choose to live in a predominantly white neighborhood and in a predominantly white community.
Right, to do that. And everyone can do that. I applaud you for doing that, and you're motivated because you have children of color. But, you know, I love to see little white kids walking around with those American dolls, but they're black, you know, just walking around. You know, and when we talk about unconscious bias, they have one that they show a little white girl looking at all these black dolls, you know, just to break that notion, you know. So, did you want to say something?
Yeah, I guess so. I really liked what you said about the onion and just all the layering that goes on. I think about like with building trust, how much that takes, and especially with intercultural and interracial friendships. And also thinking about how much easier it was for me when I was younger, in my 20s, and living in Brooklyn. Somehow New York City was an easier place to have like much more diverse friends. And I met a friend of mine who's one of the friendship that you described, like the real rich. Who's Caribbean, and I met her at work. So I think, but it takes a lot of building that trust, because it took a long time to build the trust with my friend, who's now been my friend for 30 years. But I'm also speaking as a parent. I have my kids go right here to the school next door, in Pierce, and we've been doing a parent group that's around diversity, and it's been really interesting, kind of bringing together diverse parents and including ourselves, Flair, Families Leading to Advance Racial Equity. But we're kind of building the trust right now, and it's pretty diverse, the group. But it was sort of like, how do we as parents kind of model for our kids and start to have these kind of conversations? And it takes a lot of effort, and I'm sort of becoming one of the facilitators, but more just supporting the group. And I've been trying to push us to have these uncomfortable conversations, and I really notice how it's painful. It's hard to talk about, and people want to avoid talking about race, or, you know, like, and I tried to get us to kind of do more of those conversations, and we've had some really painful conversations where some of the parents of color are shared really painful experiences in a mixed group and are crying and sharing like their just painful stories, and like just listening is really important and supporting. But we're slowly building the trust, and I hope we will become more friends. I feel like I'm building some friendships, but it's slow, and I think it's really just having that patience and leveraging that.
Well, thank you for that, because the key that I'm taking away from that, I know everybody heard what you were saying in terms of, is the role model for parents. And that can happen by, they see that you're having conversation, they see other people of color in your home, or they see you doing these things, because we know that there's studies, and I talk about the one in the book, where children that would chastise or push against their parents at younger ages, when if they say that they could not have someone, like if the kid was black, over for a sleepover, they would push back on something that's wrong. Those same kids and the same parents, by the time that they are teenagers, when they say you shouldn't go out, we don't want you, dating, or we don't want you this, they say, okay, we understand. So what happens between that time of the young child who intuitively knows that that's wrong and says, says to the parents, about the sleepover, and the time that they're teenagers, is because, again, they have all those social loadings, or they get the messages that there's something wrong.
To me, it's part of systemic nature of
Mhm.
racism.
Right.
In all of the areas of our lives that you see that, from education to health to all of those systems. And what I really like about what you said tonight is what I really believe in is the relational model. That, and I'm happy to hear as a retired principal from Pierce, that kind of relationship building exists.
Yeah.
That people are still trying to understand each other and come together across differences.
Yeah.
I'm inspired, I like your book, but I also want you to know that I'm of two minds, because I also believe that rules and policies also changes behavior. So you might not have it in your core yet, but you'll go to jail if you discriminate. I feel like that's something we also have to fight for and challenge.
Otherwise, we got an egg without a shell, we got a glue mess going on. And we assume that we have more laws around race, but what's happening now, though, is that we've said that you can't prove them until there's intention. And how do you prove intention? Because that's what's happening with Trump, when they say, oh, he's got a friends of race, and he didn't say that's not what it means, it's not racist.
That's not
So that's why we have to be careful, because remember, the people who are still setting up those laws and practices, et cetera, set them up to benefit them. So it's not about impact, it's about my intention, Yeah.
And I think it's really important that it's a both and. And, I think as a culture, we are an either or culture. And we have to keep both, sort of balls in the air at the same time, because they feed each other.
Oh, absolutely.
And,
Absolutely. And I think language represents our thinking, and words create worlds. So if we, when you ask, I'm sorry, I didn't get your name again, Bob. Bob, when you were asking for things you can do, one of it is in our language. We have to stop with this marginalized people, the oppressed people, because we are people who have experienced marginalization, but we are not marginalized people. I don't reject that. The dominant, this dominant culture, subordinate culture, that is such outdated language, or thinking about people as other, because then we have this fear of otherness. We have to start to think about, what the prototype for American, or the prototype for who we have in our organization, is not based on race, gender, ethnicity, appearance, lifestyle, money, all that kind of stuff. It should be, and what we need to do is base it on those human qualities like empathy, integrity, civility, all of those things. And the more that we can push that is who we are. And there's no such thing as the other, because we set up that other, us, them dynamic, we're always going to be like, it's a faulty paradigm, I believe. Because of the only way that you as a white man can be accountable, or to me is be an accountable ally, and to rid yourself of white guilt, is to be an accountable ally to me and help me out. I don't need white people to help me out, actually, you know. You know, and the only way that I can be who I am and get, you know, is to, you know, extract my self-worth from whites, you know, and I can't be fully who I am until whites, you know, give up their privilege and stop being racist. That's not gonna happen. That's like trying to fall in the ocean because of who we are. So what we have to do is shift that model. I don't draw my self-worth from whites. You don't, you know, cleanse your collective guilt from me, you know. You work on yourself as a white person in terms of white identity. I work on myself in terms of my racial identity. You know, we were talking about this because there's so many examples, like, you know, with a good friend of mine, and her hair is in dreads, and she was my associate vice chancellor at UMass before, and people, you know, always looking at her and kind of curious, like, you know, like stuff. And she knows that in terms of jobs, et cetera. So we were talking about this, and I just, you know, I was talking about how frustrated I get with the dominance model because it doesn't change the narrative. Because I said, I'd much rather have whites instead of being, try to help me out and support or try to eradicate, you know, help me out by voting, you know, for people who aren't racist, by taking policies and practices, by, you know, checking on, you know, all of those things and making sure that there's access in terms of healthcare, that our educational policies and practice aren't discriminatory, you know, crime, you know, looking at criminal justice reform. If we can work on that together, you know, I don't care how fragile you are. You know, I don't care how this, you know, this is what we need to work. And as my friend said to me, yeah, they can touch my hair all they want and get curious all they want if they're doing that, you know. And she said, in fact, because, you know, she goes, it is kind of curious. I kind of get curious about myself, you know. She goes, I understand that. You know, so don't say that, you know, well, you know, I think we have a lot of simplistic things that people give out, especially whites. Well, don't ask people about white people about their hair. Don't do this, don't, you know, it's crazy. So I'm going to go so people can buy the book and sign, you know, and have a conversation. This is conversation. I hope you